First up, we have Caitlin Rose. She is the North Carolina and Virginia Policy Manager at SSDN, where she advocates and advances state policy priorities, strengthens member resources, and fosters regional partnerships across the Southeast. With a background in environmental science, atmospheric chemistry, and public health, she brings an interdisciplinary approach to sustainability and local climate action. Prior to SSDN, she worked with the Triangle J Council of Governments and the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, contributing to clean transportation initiatives and the development of the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan. Welcome, Caitlin. So happy to have you here. I'm going to pass the baton to you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Gretchen.
Yeah.
I'll get my screen sharing. It's really good to be here and see all of, at least your names popping up in the participant window. Gretchen, can you all see my screen? Okay, wonderful. Well, as Gretchen mentioned, my name is Caitlin Rose. I am the policy director at SSDN. So we serve SSDN is a close partner of SIA's in the BRESE collaborative, and our policy program serves members in a variety of southeastern states. Gretchen mentioned North Carolina and Virginia. We also provide policy services in South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida, and we're looking at boosting our capacity in our westernmost states as well. So if you are a local government in any of the 10 states that SSDN serves and you have a question about state energy policy, feel free to get in touch with me at any point. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about building codes and how they intersect with energy affordability at a high level. So I'm hoping that my presentation can kind of frame up how building codes work from a state level and sort of how that influences the conversation around energy affordability broadly across the region. And then I'm really looking forward to my subsequent panelists' presentations to kind of put that a little bit more into practice for you all today. So I'm going to start us at a high level, just talking about the affordability issue in the region. We kind of live in a bit of a paradox here in the Southeast where we boast about often having really low electric rates, but our region faces some of the highest rates of energy burden nationally. So I've just thrown up a couple statistics to sort of frame this up. 33% of US households currently are struggling to pay their energy bills. We've seen a pretty substantial rise in electricity bills, average monthly electricity bills since 2021, and a pretty high percentage in the Southeast of low-income households that are facing energy burden. So what that means in practice is folks living in households that are high energy burden are having to make some pretty complicated and high stakes decisions about what they pay for each month. Do they pay their electricity bill, or do they pay for things like food, fuel in their car, healthcare, medications, and things like that? So it's a really, for a lot of people on the ground, a pretty high stakes issue. This isn't just a budget or a line item in their budget. It's a point of insecurity that folks in the Southeast are having to make questions or answer questions about on a daily basis. So my hope with this framing is to make building codes a little bit more visible than they typically are. Building codes are pretty archaic in terms of how they're written. They're really jargony. They're documents that are, pretty inaccessible to the average person. But when it intersects with energy affordability, this is really where building codes move from that technical jargon into actual human impact for the lives of residents of the communities we all serve. Building codes, as you all know, are the minimum requirements for building envelope insulation and many other things that happen when someone is deciding to build a development, a home, a commercial building. And when we talk about energy codes, we're talking about that insulation, air leakage, building envelopes, but we're also talking about the health and safety of folks who live in those buildings and their quality of life broadly across the region. And so I wanted to take us, or to have us pause and take a look at sort of the state of codes in the Southeast. This is just a snapshot. It's not all of the states in the Southeastern region, but I thought it was sort of a good representative example of where we're at in terms of code adoption. So to back it up a little bit, the International Code Council is sort of the governing body that sets model codes that can be adopted at the state level. There is no federal requirement for a building code standard, so this is kind of up to the states. And a lot of how building codes are implemented depends on the code level that states have adopted. So kind of across the Southeast, we are a little bit of a mixed bag. It's a little bit of a patchwork approach. We have some states like Florida and Louisiana that have moved towards that 2021 International Code Council Energy Conservation Code standard, which is one of the more up-to-date codes out there. But we have several states that are still lagging or frozen in place with codes dating back to 2009 or 2015. And a lot has changed in how we build things since 2009, which makes it raises some concern about the ability of states to build efficient and safe and healthy homes for folks in their states. And so you might be asking yourself, why is it so different across the states? Why does this look, depending on what state you're in, why are you seeing codes that are nearly 15 years different in terms of their adoption year? And this comes down to a pretty jargony legal framework called the Dillon Rule versus Home Rule. So for those of you who work for local governments, you're probably pretty familiar with your state's framework if you are a Dillon or a Home Rule state. But just at a high level, Dillon Rule states local governments cannot take actions unless they are explicitly given the authority to do so by their state legislatures. So that's states like Virginia, North Carolina, and several others in the Southeast. Local governments are pretty constrained in the actions they can take. And then in home rule states, local governments have a little bit more flexibility. They're given the autonomy to make local planning decisions, pass ordinances, adopt zoning codes without, the express permission of their legislatures. But across the Southeast, we are seeing trends of state legislatures preempting local authority and sort of taking away that inherent authority that local governments have to make these decisions. So in Dillon Rule states, local governments are constrained by whatever code the state adopts. And in home rule states, depending on state statute, sometimes local governments can adopt, local amendments that are more stringent than the state code, but oftentimes they are also sort of hemmed in by where the state sets their code. And I will say too, several states, and we're going to talk a little bit about hurdles here, several states in the Southeast also have enabling statutes that either require state legislation to update building codes or have frozen building codes in place. So South Carolina requires legislative action to update state building codes. And if you'll recall from the previous slide, South Carolina's codes are frozen at the 2009 levels. In North Carolina, where I live, the legislature recently passed a bill that froze the building codes at the 2015 Energy Conservation Code level and has put a moratorium on building code updates until 2031. So 5 years from now, that's the next time the Building Code Council will be able to update the statewide building codes. We will have been frozen around we'll be, essentially 15 years behind the most up-to-date code that's out there. So there's lots of reasons why stronger codes stall, and there's ways we can think about, from a variety of different levers about how to get that unstuck and moving a little bit. So oftentimes there's industry opposition to the perceived upfront cost of stronger energy codes, and the actual cost over the lifetime of the home is pretty invisible compared to the upfront cost of building to a more stringent, more energy efficient building code. As I said, there's also legislative hurdles in a lot of the southeastern states that need to be overcome to actually update those codes. And then a lot of issues, regionally and nationally with staffing and capacity for actual building code enforcement. Same thing I mentioned, this kind of ties into industry opposition as well as legislative hurdles, but awareness gaps with key decision makers. A lot of times folks don't actually understand the full scope of what a building code does and doesn't do. As I said, it's not very flashy. We're talking about building insulation. We're talking about the building envelope, things that a lot of people who aren't, thinking and talking about these things on a day-to-day basis don't have to usually consider. And again, that upfront cost or the lifetime savings is invisible a lot of times to developers and buyers upfront. And I will say too, wanting to focus more on the positive, there's a lot of opportunity here in the Southeast if building codes were modernized. As a region, I mentioned there's lots of ways that states are lagging behind or residents in the Southeast are facing really high energy costs and energy burden, but that just means we have the most to gain from updating our codes. So there's some recent ACEEE analysis that shows that there's several states in our region that stand to gain the most potential cost savings from updated specifically residential energy codes. And then 3 examples, that's Arkansas, Tennessee, and South Carolina. So something, a pretty quick impact, at least with the residential code, could be achieved around the region in the Southeast. Updating codes also, in addition to having a cost-saving benefit and an affordability benefit for residents, also has co-benefits for resilience. So as we all know, we're seeing increased storms and natural disasters here in the Southeast, particularly as we're going into hurricane season. That's something that I know a lot of folks around the region are actively thinking about. I wanted to point to an example from Florida. Florida, if you'll recall, their building code is updated to that 2021 code level. Those modern codes have been calculated to have prevented between $1 and $3 billion in damage from Hurricane Ian. So that's a pretty real, pretty stark number in terms of disaster response and recovery. That type of cost savings is not something you typically see when you're talking about disaster response. Same thing in Louisiana with post-storm grid hardening and leading to rate hikes for customers. More efficient homes might suffer higher costs there. So, sort of the penalizing of efficient homes is something to consider when if we're talking about states that don't have building codes that are as updated. There's a couple other examples here I'm not going to focus specifically on, but if we're thinking about resilience and energy affordability in tandem with each other, there's a lot to gain in the Southeast from updating building codes. And thinking through sort of pathways forward, just wanted to throw these up here as a visual, but really specifically wanted to talk about ways local governments and communities can get involved in this conversation. Most states, building codes are set by a governing body, whether that's a building code council or a board or a commission. Oftentimes, there are municipal or local government seats on those building code councils. So if you are super fired up about building codes, I would suggest taking a look at the makeup of your state's building code council to see, is there a seat that a municipal representative could sit in on and provide input on the code update process in your state. Same thing for communities or local governments and community organizations. When states are updating their building codes, oftentimes that's a public process. It's a little bit, hard to parse if you're not used to paying attention to these things, but there's usually public comment processes if you want to ask questions and raise concerns to those governing bodies. So there's lots of ways to participate in this process. And happy to talk offline about any of that if you're local government in SSDN's footprint, if there's ways to get involved and from that perspective. I think that's all I've got. So hopefully that helps sort of frame up where we're at in the Southeast and sort of where each state stands and maybe what opportunities exist across the region. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and I will pass it to our next presenter.
Thank you, Caitlin. Really appreciate that. Folks, if you're still simmering with everything that's shared, please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go about. I was wondering, Caitlin, if you could maybe talk a little bit more to tools and resources at SSDN to help, just to give folks insight.
Yeah. So as I said, SSDN's policy program, of which I'm one of the 5 team members, is the primary resource that we have to support local government education, capacity building, and engagement around state building codes. So if you are not already participating, if you're an SSDN member and not already participating in our monthly state network calls, reach out to me and we'll make sure you have access to those calls as a resource. We have prepared several different sort of sample backgrounder documents in the past. So we have some existing resources in addition to the ones that the BRESE Collaborative has pulled together around statewide building codes, as well as the update processes in a couple different states. And we're working on building that out a little bit more across the region. And then we have also worked with our members to help them think through if they are interested in actively engaging with the building code update process, sort of how to frame the local government perspective in that engagement. So if that's ever of interest to local governments, that is what we're here to do and happy to support it.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. I got 2 more questions. I think we have time for one more. I see in the chat, Justin asked, are there strategies for translating energy codes to everyday life, specifically people not in the space? And you showed stats on energy savings, and it seems like an important component in sharing the benefits.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Justin. I think that's something that all of us working in really technical fields could stand to do better. As I said, building codes are really technical. If you open up the IECC and try to read it and you're not well caffeinated and ready to really pay attention to all the jargon in there, it's really hard to understand. And I mean, I'll speak from firsthand experience. When I was first diving into the North Carolina building codes, it is a pretty steep learning curve. So I think as much as we can tie these really technical, jargony, but really important regulatory frameworks back to the impacts that everyday people are feeling, I think we'll be better served. So the more we can say, if a state were to adopt the, let's say, 2021 IECC, this is the bill savings we might expect to see, or this jump in energy efficiency, what does that actually mean for a resident paying an electric bill every month? I think those types of easy to digest hard numbers that people can actually apply to their day-to-day lives are much better ways to message around the impacts of or what building codes do on a day-to-day basis than talking about, the code, the model year, or whatever other technical aspect of the building code as written in state code. So I think the more we can translate to everyday impacts, the better.
Awesome. Go ahead, Gretchen. I'm passing it back to you. Right.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And I'm just going to make a plug we have another working group on stakeholder collaboration tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern. And Caitlin's going to be diving in a little deeper to what stakeholder collaboration really needs to be in this space. So consider joining and we'll talk more about collaboration, which I think is, again, BRESE Collaborative is very key to a lot of the work that we're all doing. Great. Thank you so much.